In a world where men are trained to remain invisible, to blend into shadows and execute missions with surgical precision, there exists a unique code among the elite. Never get distracted. Never let emotion compromise the mission. But what happens when a single glimpse of something extraordinary forces a hardened warrior to question everything he believes about himself? When a tattoo on a stranger's wrist becomes the beginning of a story neither of them saw coming, a tale that will test the boundaries between duty and destiny, between the soldier he was trained to be and the man he was meant to become. This is the moment that changed everything. Commander Derek Hayes had spent the last 17 years of his life learning how to observe without being observed. His eyes were trained to catch details that normal people would miss in a heartbeat. The way a suspect held their weapon, the slight tension in a person's shoulders before they struck, the micro-expressions that revealed lies before they were even spoken. These skills had saved his life countless times. They had also killed more than he cared to remember. But on a quiet Tuesday evening in a coffee shop in San Diego, none of that training prepared him for what was about to happen. He had been sitting in the corner booth at Marino's Coffee House, the same spot he always took when he needed to decompress after a brutal week of training new recruits. The afternoon sun filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden tables. Derek's coffee had gone cold at least 20 minutes ago, but he hadn't touched it. His attention was split between a classified briefing document on his encrypted laptop and the usual crowd of civilians going about their ordinary lives. College students with their textbooks scattered around them, young professionals typing away on their phones, elderly couples holding hands over their drinks. It was mundane. It was safe. It was exactly what he needed. That's when she walked in. Derek didn't look up immediately. His consciousness registered the opening of the door, the small bell that chimed above it, the change in air pressure that came with the arrival of another human being. But these were automatic observations, things his body registered without his mind actively engaging. He continued reading the same paragraph about tactical procedures that he had been staring at for the past 5 minutes, fully intending to ignore this new presence like he ignored everything else. But then she moved deeper into the coffee shop, and something made him glance up. She was striking in the way that certain people are. Not because she was conventionally beautiful, though she was certainly that. No, it was something else. Something about the way she carried herself. She moved with a kind of quiet confidence, the same kind that Derek saw in his fellow operators, the same kind that came from having faced something difficult and survived it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a light blue sundress that seemed at odds with the intensity in her eyes. Those eyes, Derek noticed, were constantly moving, constantly assessing. They reminded him of his own. He watched as she approached the counter and ordered a cappuccino, paying with cash, leaving no trace in any digital system. Derek's analytical mind immediately flagged this as unusual. Most people didn't think about such things. They swiped their cards without hesitation, leaving digital breadcrumbs wherever they went. But this woman, she was deliberate. She was careful. She was, Derek thought with sudden interest, exactly like him in some indefinable way. As she waited for her drink, she absently raised her left hand to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. It was in that moment, in that simple, everyday gesture, that Derek saw it, the tattoo on her wrist. It was small, intricate, and unmistakably a military insignia. But not just any military insignia. Derek's breath caught in his throat, a reaction so involuntary and powerful that he had to cover it with a cough, because the symbol on her wrist was one that he recognized with absolute certainty. It was the mark of the Joint Special Operations Command. It was the mark of someone who operated in the shadows, just like him. But there was more to it. The specific variation of the insignia, the way it had been modified with additional elements, meant something else entirely. It meant she had served with a specific unit, a unit that had been deactivated nearly 8 years ago, a unit that Derek himself had been part of. The woman took her cappuccino from the barista and turned to find a seat. For a moment, Derek thought she might notice him staring. For a moment, he allowed himself to hope that she would recognize him from those days, from that time when they had both been different people, doing work that no one would ever know about. But her eyes passed over him without catching, and she chose a table near the window, settling into her chair with a small sigh, as if she too were trying to decompress from something difficult. Derek should have looked away. He knew this. He knew that continuing to stare at her was unprofessional, that it violated his own carefully maintained code of conduct. He knew that drawing her attention could potentially compromise something, though he couldn't quite articulate what. But he found that he couldn't look away. His eyes remained fixed on the small tattoo on her wrist, barely visible as she wrapped her hands around her cappuccino cup. And he felt something shift inside him, something that had been dormant for so long that he'd almost forgotten it existed. He knew, with the kind of certainty that only came from experience, that she was someone important, that she was someone dangerous, that she was someone who could change everything. For the next 45 minutes, Derek sat in that coffee shop and pretended to work on his laptop while actually doing nothing of the sort. His eyes tracked her movements with the precision of a hunter following prey. He noted the way she checked her phone repeatedly, each time with a slight frown. He observed the moment when her shoulders tensed, as if she were responding to some internal pressure that only she could feel. He saw her glance toward the door several times, as if she were expecting someone, or perhaps dreading someone's arrival. And then, just as suddenly as the tension had appeared, it seemed to drain away. She took a long sip of her cappuccino, which must have been cold by then, and she pulled out a small journal from her bag. Derek watched as she began writing, her pen moving across the pages with quick, deliberate strokes. Whatever she was writing, it seemed to matter. Her entire body language changed, became focused, became alive in a way that it hadn't been before. Derek found himself wondering what could possibly demand such concentration from someone who clearly spent her life in a world of calculated risks and carefully managed emotions. What could be so important that it required this kind of dedicated attention? What was she running from, or running toward? The answer came when the door to the coffee shop opened again, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, well-dressed with the kind of cultivated appearance that suggested money and connections. But Derek's eyes went immediately to the telltale bulge under the man's jacket, barely visible but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. A gun. The man was armed, which meant that whatever brought him to Marino's coffee house on this quiet Tuesday evening, it wasn't a social visit. The woman at the window table saw him the same moment that Derek did. Derek watched as her entire body went rigid. Her hand froze mid-sentence on the page of her journal. The pen stopped moving. And for just a fraction of a second, Derek saw something flicker across her face. Fear? Determination? Both? But then her expression shifted, became blank, became neutral. She closed her journal slowly and deliberately, tucking it back into her bag. She didn't look up at the man, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way, but Derek could see the subtle shift in her posture, the minute adjustment of her legs beneath the table, the way her right hand moved to the armrest of her chair, positioning itself for quick movement. These were the micro-movements of someone preparing for violence. These were the movements Derek had been trained to make himself. The man in the doorway stood for a moment, his eyes scanning the coffee shop. Derek watched as those eyes moved across the woman, lingered for a fraction of a second, and then continued their sweep. The man was looking for someone, and when his eyes finally landed on Derek's corner booth, Derek felt something click into place inside him. The man was looking for him. Derek's hand moved to his phone with practiced ease, but he didn't look away from the window. He initiated a silent alarm code, 3 specific button presses that would alert his team back at the base that he needed extraction. In situations like this, 17 years of training superseded every other instinct. His mission was to get out without being compromised. His mission was to protect the people around him by ensuring that whatever was about to happen didn't happen here, in a public place, with civilians scattered throughout the coffee shop. He was already calculating exit routes, already preparing his cover story for why he was about to leave, already mentally rehearsing the sequence of movements that would get him out the back door and into the alley behind the building, when the woman did something completely unexpected. She stood up, not in the sudden, aggressive way that would draw immediate attention, but in a deliberate, careful way, as if she was simply a customer who had finished her coffee and decided to leave. But as she stood, and as she turned to walk toward the door, directly toward the armed man, her hand brushed against her leg, and for just a moment, Derek saw the bottom portion of the tattoo on her wrist, saw the name that had been incorporated into the design, a name that made his blood run cold. It was his name, Derek. Before he could process what that could possibly mean, before he could even begin to form a coherent thought about the implications of a complete stranger wearing a tattoo with his name, the woman was moving past the armed man, slipping through the door with the same fluid grace with which she had entered. The man in the doorway didn't follow her immediately. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Derek's booth. And in that moment, with his cover potentially blown and a stranger wearing his name on her wrist walking out of his life, Derek Hayes made a decision that 17 years of training told him was reckless and dangerous. He closed his laptop, stood up slowly, and walked directly toward the door, directly toward the armed man, as if he had no awareness of the threat. He had to know. He had to understand who she was and why his name was written on her skin like a secret she was carrying. As he passed the man in the doorway, Derek's shoulder brushed against his with just enough pressure to make a point. It was a warning. A promise. And as Derek stepped out into the San Diego evening, he knew with absolute certainty that his life had just divided into two distinct parts, before he saw that tattoo and everything that would come after. Part 2. The Echoes of the Past. The woman moved through the streets of San Diego with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that standing still equaled vulnerability. She didn't run. Running would draw attention, would trigger the predatory instinct in the man who now knew that she was aware of him. Instead, she walked with purpose, taking a route that she had mapped out mentally weeks ago, should this moment ever arrive. She had always known it would. You didn't carry someone else's name on your skin as a form of prayer, without knowing that prayer would eventually be answered. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. And the name on her wrist, Derek, represented both the greatest love and the greatest loss of her life. She'd been 19 years old when she first met him. It was at a recruitment center in Baltimore, a place where young, idealistic people went with dreams of serving their country and becoming part of something greater than themselves. Sarah had been one of those young people, driven by something she couldn't quite explain at the time, but understood now as a deep need to prove herself, to prove that she was stronger and more capable than the circumstances of her birth had suggested. Derek had been there in his capacity as a SEAL recruiter, assessing potential candidates for the Naval Special Warfare Program. He was young then, too, only 22, but already carrying the weight of someone who had seen more than most people see in a lifetime. His eyes had found hers across the crowded room, and for just a moment they had shared something, an understanding, perhaps, of what it meant to be an outsider, to carry pain and loss, and to channel it into something productive. He had approached her afterward, and they had talked for 3 hours. At the time, Sarah had thought he was interested in her as a potential recruit. It took her several years to understand that he had been interested in her as a human being, as a fellow broken person trying to put themselves back together through service to something larger than their own trauma. She had joined the Navy. She had completed SEAL training, making herself one of the few women to ever earn that distinction. She had been part of a specialized unit that focused on intelligence gathering and precision operations in theaters of conflict that officially didn't exist. And through it all, Derek had been there. Not always literally present, but always aware. Always watching out for her. Always serving as both her commanding officer and something that neither of them had ever explicitly named, but both of them had felt. The relationship had been complicated by duty. Military protocol made anything romantic impossible. But there were moments, brief, stolen moments, where the mask of professional distance fell away. There were nights when they had sat under desert stars and spoken about the people they had killed, the decisions they had made, the weight they carried. There were mornings when Derek had found her after a particularly difficult mission and simply held her without saying anything, because words couldn't encompass what they both understood. And then came the operation that changed everything. It had been classified at the time, and it remained classified even now. Sarah couldn't speak about what had happened, not to anyone, not even to the therapists that the military had eventually forced her to see. But the operation had gone wrong in a way that military operations weren't supposed to go wrong. Mistakes had been made. People had died who shouldn't have. And Derek, strong, capable, unshakable Derek, had made a choice to take the blame for something that wasn't entirely his fault, to fall on his metaphorical sword in order to protect the rest of the team, including Sarah. He had been deactivated shortly after, quietly removed from the unit, given a cover story about needing to step back from field work due to family issues. Sarah had wanted to follow him into retirement, wanted to throw away her career and build something ordinary with him, something normal and safe and far removed from the world of black ops and midnight insertions. He had told her, in that final conversation they had ever had as part of the same military structure, that her duty came first, that she had the potential to become greater than he would ever be, that if she threw away her career for him, she would eventually resent him for it. And though it had broken something inside her, She had understood that he was right. She had continued on with the unit. She had climbed the ranks. She had become, over the years, exactly what he had predicted, greater than he ever was. The unit had been deactivated about 8 years ago, ostensibly due to budget concerns and shifting military priorities. In reality, Sarah suspected that some of the operations they had conducted had finally caught up with the government, that transparency and accountability had demanded the unit's dissolution. The moment the deactivation papers had been signed, Sarah had left the military as well. She couldn't imagine working in that world without Derek, couldn't imagine being part of an organization that had fundamentally changed without him in it. That was when she had gotten the tattoo. Not immediately, but over time, as she had tried to figure out who she was when you took away the military identity, when you removed the clear chain of command and the defined purpose. She had wanted something permanent, something that would prove that what had happened between her and Derek had been real, that it hadn't just been a product of stress and proximity and shared danger. So she had found a tattoo artist in Oakland and had him incorporate Derek's name into a modified version of their unit insignia. It had been her way of carrying him with her, even though they hadn't seen each other in 8 years. Now, walking through the streets of San Diego with someone following her, Sarah wondered if that had been foolish. If keeping his name on her skin had somehow served as a beacon, drawing him back into her life whether either of them wanted it or not. Or if it had been fate. If the universe had decided that they had unfinished business, that they couldn't move forward into whatever came next without facing each other at least one more time. The man following her was becoming less careful. She could hear his footsteps now, heavier and more deliberate. He was no longer trying to stay hidden. He was trying to corner her, to push her into a situation where she would have to respond, where she would have to reveal her capabilities and her knowledge. He wanted her to know that he was there. He wanted her afraid. Sarah ducked into a parking garage. This was calculated. The garage would be public enough that he couldn't immediately resort to violence, but private enough that they could have a conversation without witnesses. She walked to the 3rd level, moving toward the back of the structure, positioning herself between 2 large SUVs, and then she turned and waited. The man emerged from the stairwell perhaps 2 minutes later. He was breathing harder than his physical exertion warranted, which suggested nervousness. He reached inside his jacket for his weapon, and Sarah's hand moved faster than thought. She had trained for scenarios like this for 2 decades. Her body knew what to do, even if her mind was still trying to catch up with the reality of what was happening. "Don't," she said simply. One word. But the weight of conviction behind it was enough to make him pause. "You don't want to do this." The man's hand froze. His eyes narrowed as he studied her, really studied her. For the first time, recognition flickered across his face. Not personal recognition, but professional recognition. He knew what she was. He understood that drawing a weapon against her would be a terminal mistake. "You're Sarah Mitchell?" he said. Not a question. "I was," she replied. "I'm not anymore. I'm nobody. I'm a ghost. And you need to understand that whatever brought you to that coffee shop, whatever orders you were given, they're about to become very difficult to follow if you don't walk away right now." The man's jaw clenched. She could see him weighing his options, calculating his chances of success. 17 years of military life had taught Sarah to recognize that particular pattern of thinking. That moment when someone is deciding whether to continue on a dangerous path or to choose safety instead. "I can't," he said finally. "People are depending on me." "People are always depending on someone," Sarah said. "But I need you to understand something. The man in the coffee shop, if he's who I think he is, he's not someone you want to be responsible for harming. He has made a lot of friends over the years. Powerful friends. Friends who deal in a currency that most governments can't even quantify. Walking away now is your only path to survival." Whether it was the conviction in her voice or the logic of her words, the man finally released the gun. He raised his hand slowly, backing away toward the stairwell. "I was told to make contact," he said. "I was told to bring you both in." "Bring us in for what?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I don't know," the man said, and Sarah believed him. People like this, field operatives given simple instructions and minimal context, rarely knew the bigger picture. "But the orders came from high up, very high up, and they said if I didn't succeed, there would be consequences for my family." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. Threats against families were the government's most effective tool for coercion. She understood it. She had leveraged similar threats herself during interrogations. But knowing the mechanism didn't make it any easier to accept. "What's your name?" she asked. "Martinez," the man replied. "Agent Tom Martinez. Tell whoever sent you that you found Derek Hayes in that coffee shop but he escaped before you could apprehend him. Tell them that I was never there. And then, Agent Martinez, I suggest you find a way to protect your family that doesn't involve doing the government's bidding, because something big is coming. Something that's going to shake loose a lot of secrets that people would prefer remain buried." Watched him disappear down the stairwell. And then, alone in the parking garage, surrounded by metal and concrete and the echoes of a past she had never quite escaped, Sarah made her own decision. She pulled out her phone, a burner phone that she used for emergencies, and typed a simple message. "I saw a ghost today. Turns out the ghost saw me too. We need to talk. Same place we promised to meet. 30 years, we said. Looks like 8 will have to do." She sent it to a number she had memorized but never used in all the years since they had parted. Derek's number. A number he probably didn't even have active anymore. But Sarah had faith in the security services, in the infrastructure that kept people connected, even when they were trying to disconnect from each other. As she left the parking garage and stepped back out into the San Diego evening, the sun finally dipping below the horizon, Sarah felt something shift inside her. For 8 years, she had been half a person. Half of a whole that had been split by duty and circumstance and choices that neither of them had fully controlled. But the universe, in its mysterious way, had decided that it was time for the other half to come home. Derek would have gotten her message by now. And if she knew him, and she did better than she had ever known anyone, he would be coming. Not because she had asked him to, but because he had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. Some bond, Sarah understood, couldn't be broken by time or distance or deliberate separation. Some bonds were simply too strong to fight against. Part 3. The reckoning. Derek's hand shook as he read the message. It was a small thing, hands shaking, the kind of involuntary response that most people would consider weakness. But Derek had spent his entire adult life in control of his physical responses, had trained himself to maintain steady hands even in the face of incoming fire, even when death was approaching at close range. The fact that his hands were shaking now told him everything he needed to know about what this moment meant. 30 years. That had been their promise, made in the kind of late-night conversation that soldiers have when they're young and stupid enough to believe that the future is something they can plan for. They had said that if they were ever both alive and free at the same time, 30 years from then, they would find each other and build something normal. Something that didn't involve secrets or kills counts or the weight of classified information that could never be discussed. 8 years had passed since their last meaningful interaction. And now, Derek understood, that promise was being called in with interest. He didn't go home. Going home would leave a trail, would provide a known location that could be monitored and watched. Instead, Derek drove to a storage facility in the outskirts of San Diego, one that he had rented under a false name years ago, immediately after leaving the military. Inside that storage unit was everything he had kept from his operational days: documentation, photographs, equipment, money in multiple currencies, and several passports with his face and different names. He had hoped never to need any of it again. But Derek had learned long ago that hope and reality rarely aligned in the world he inhabited. He took the money, $50,000 in cash, and the passports. He left his phone, the tracker in his watch, his credit cards. All of it could be monitored. All of it could give away his location. Derek existed now in the margins, moving through the city with the skill of someone who had spent 2 decades learning how to be invisible. He used cash at gas stations, paid attention to security cameras, took routes that didn't follow obvious patterns. The place Sarah had referenced, the same place we promised to meet, wasn't actually a place at all. It was a code, a reference to a conversation they had had in the encrypted messaging app that the military had provided. Messages that should have been purged from the system years ago. Derek had those messages memorized, had read through them so many times over the years that the words were burned into his memory, like a brand. In those messages, they had discussed where they would go if they ever had the chance to leave everything behind. A small cabin in the Cascade Mountains, somewhere remote and beautiful, somewhere that required no documentation and no explanation, somewhere that existed on no maps that any government could access. Derek had been researching the location for years. He knew exactly how to get there. He knew the roads that weren't watched, the areas that had weak cell service, the natural entry points that avoided any kind of official checkpoint or monitoring. It would take him 2 days of driving, and it would require him to be extremely careful about the route he took, but he could do it. What worried him was what he would find when he got there. Was Sarah really alive? Or was this some kind of trap, some operation designed to flush him out of whatever hole he had crawled into to live out the rest of his life in obscurity? Derek had made many enemies over the years, people he had testified against, operations that had gone wrong, intelligence he had gathered on individuals who now held positions of significant power. Any number of those people could have orchestrated this in order to get him back into the light, to expose him to scrutiny and danger. But underneath that worry, deeper than the strategic analysis and the threat assessment, Derek felt something else. Something that had been dormant inside him for 8 years. Hope. Genuine, irrational, dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, the universe was giving him a second chance. That maybe Sarah was still alive, still thinking of him, still carrying his name on her skin as a form of prayer. The drive took him through California and into Oregon. He slept in his car in rest areas, paid for motel rooms with cash, bought food at small-town diners where the owners didn't ask questions. No one seemed to notice him. No one seemed to be following him. By the time he reached the small hiking town that served as the closest civilization to the cabin, Derek had almost convinced himself that maybe he was going to make it. Maybe he was actually going to see her again. The cabin had been built in 1987, long before Derek and Sarah had even met. It belonged to a former Navy SEAL named Robert Caldwell, a man Derek had served with years ago, and who had since passed away from cancer. Caldwell's will had left the cabin to Derek, one of the few people who had been kind to him during his final months. Derek had inherited the property quietly, paid the taxes through a shell corporation, and never told anyone that he owned it. As far as any government database was concerned, the cabin was owned by a long-dead business entity and maintained by no one. The property access was through a hiking trail that ran along a creek. Derek parked his car miles away in a location that would seem like a normal visitor parking area for the hiking trail, and hiked in over terrain that he knew had minimal surveillance. It took him 3 hours to reach the cabin, even moving quickly and efficiently. The door was unlocked. Derek's hand moved to his waist where he was carrying the Glock that he had retrieved from the storage unit. He drew it with practiced ease, stepping to the side of the doorframe, using the wall as cover. He could see light inside, the warm glow of lantern light filtering through the windows. Someone was inside. Someone who wanted him to know they were there. He took a breath, steadied his nerve, and pushed the door open. Sarah was sitting on the floor in front of the fireplace, her back to him, warming her hands by the flames. She was still wearing the blue sundress from the coffee shop, and her hair was still in its ponytail. If Derek hadn't known better, he would have thought that no time had passed at all, that the 8 years of separation were nothing but a bad dream. "Hello, Derek," she said, not turning around. "I was wondering how long you would take to get here." "Sarah," he said, and the simple act of speaking her name aloud after so many years nearly broke him. His voice came out hoarse, rough with emotion that he had thought he had trained himself to suppress. "What is this? What are we doing?" She turned then, slowly, deliberately, her eyes meeting his across the distance of the small cabin. And Derek saw what 8 years of life outside the military had done to her. She looked older, yes, but not in a way that suggested age. Rather, she looked like someone who had finally stopped carrying the weight of duty. There was something more peaceful in her expression, something more genuine. But underneath that peace, Derek could still see the remnants of the warrior she had been. That would never fully go away. Once you had been shaped by violence and sacrifice, you carried those shapes forever. "We need to talk," Sarah said simply, "about what's coming, about what's happening right now. But more than that, we need to figure out what we're going to do about us." Derek lowered his weapon slowly, holstering it. He crossed the distance between them and sat down beside her on the floor, near enough that he could feel the warmth from the fire reflecting off her skin. "There is no us," he said, though the words felt like lies even as he spoke them. "There was, once, but that was another life. We're different people now." "Are we?" Sarah asked. She raised her left hand, the one with his name tattooed on her wrist. She placed it on top of his hand, letting him feel the weight of it, the reality of it. Do you feel like a different person, Derek? Because I don't. I feel like I've been incomplete for 8 years, like something essential was cut out of me, and I've been walking around with the missing piece ever since. Derek looked at their hands, overlaid on top of each other, firelight casting shadows across their skin. He wanted to tell her that she was right, that he felt the same way. He wanted to pull her close and forget about all the years of separation, forget about the complications and the duty and the reasons they had pushed each other away. But Derek had spent his entire life making hard decisions, and he knew that making the easy choice right now would ultimately cost them both. "There's something else," he said. "There's a reason why people are looking for us. There's a reason why Agent Martinez showed up at that coffee shop, why someone ordered him to bring us in. Something is happening, Sarah. Something big, and I need you to tell me what you know." Sarah pulled her hand away and nodded slowly. She stood up and walked to a small table in the corner of the cabin, returning with a manila folder. She handed it to him without comment. Derek opened it and began reading. What he found inside caused his blood to run cold. Documents, photographs, names, a list of every Black Ops mission that their unit had ever conducted, along with the civilian casualties that had resulted. Not estimates, actual numbers. An actual reckoning. And attached to these documents was a memo dated from just 3 weeks ago, originating from someone very high up in the Department of Defense, someone Derek recognized as having significant influence. The memo was marked for destruction, but someone, Sarah presumably, had gotten her hands on a copy. The memo outlined a plan to tie up loose ends, to remove any documentation that might prove that the government had conducted illegal operations, to silence anyone who had knowledge of those operations. A plan that had Derek and Sarah's names on it, a plan that had several of their former colleagues' names on it as well, each name marked with either a check mark or an X. Derek didn't need to ask what the X meant. He already knew.
"This is real?"
He asked.
"Very real,"
Sarah confirmed. "I found out about it 2 weeks ago through a contact I maintained outside the system. Someone still inside who understood that what was happening was wrong. They gave me the information and told me to run, to hide, but also told me that you needed to know, that this affected you too." "Why are we still alive?" Derek asked. "If this plan has been in motion for 2 weeks, why haven't they already come after us?" "Because they don't know where we are," Sarah said. "Both of us disappeared completely after we left the military. No digital footprint, no financial trail, no contact with anyone from the old days. But the operation at the coffee shop was their first attempt to locate us, to confirm that we were still alive and to bring us in. If that agent had succeeded in capturing us, we would already be dead, made to look like accidents, suicides, collateral damage in some unrelated situation." Derek closed the folder and looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and he understood that the 18-year-old girl who had walked into that recruitment center in Baltimore, the 19-year-old who had fallen in love with a broken young man who was trying to fix himself through service, she was gone. The woman standing in front of him was someone who had been forged in the same fires that had forged him. Someone who had faced the worst parts of their government and was now standing against it. Someone who deserved better than the life they had been given. "What do you want to do?" Derek asked. "I want to go public," Sarah said. "I want to give these documents to the press. I want every operation, every civilian casualty, every illegal decision to be exposed to the light. I want to make sure that the people responsible face justice, and that the people like us, the ones who are following orders, understand that those orders were wrong. I want to burn it all down." Derek nodded slowly. He had expected something like this. Sarah had always been idealistic underneath the tactical training, had always believed that the right thing to do was possible, even when everything in their world suggested otherwise. "If we do this," Derek said, "we're committing ourselves to a different kind of life. We won't be able to disappear anymore. We'll be visible, exposed. They'll come after us in a different way. They'll use courts and legal systems instead of bullets, but they'll still come."
"I know,"
Sarah said.
"but we can't live in hiding forever."
"Neither of us are built for that life. We need purpose. We need to matter. And right now, this is what matters." Derek thought about the promise they had made so many years ago, 30 years until they could be together. But life, he had learned, didn't always follow the timeline that you planned for. Sometimes things accelerated. Sometimes the future arrived ahead of schedule. Then we do this together, Derek said, just like we did everything else. He pulled Sarah close to him, and for the first time in 8 years, he let himself feel the full weight of what she meant to him, not as a soldier, not as part of a mission or an operation, but as a human being, as the other half of something that had been split far too long ago. The next morning, Derek made contact with a journalist he had known years ago, before Derek's world had turned dark. The journalist was now working for one of the major national papers, had a reputation for honesty and integrity, and had been investigating government corruption for over a decade. Derek arranged a meeting in a public place where they couldn't be easily eliminated. Within a week, the documents were public. Within a month, investigations had been launched. Within 3 months, the political landscape of the country had shifted. 7 government officials resigned. 12 more were indicted on various charges. The unit that Derek and Sarah had served with became a symbol of a government system gone wrong. A cautionary tale about what happened when power was left unchecked and accountability was abandoned. Derek and Sarah testified before Congress, their faces broadcast on every news channel in the country. They became witnesses, refugees, people who had made the choice to tell the truth knowing the cost. And through it all, they remained together, not hidden anymore, not separate. Together, standing in the light, facing whatever consequences awaited them. On a cold evening, 6 months after their reunion in the cabin, Derek sat with Sarah on the porch of a small house in Portland, Oregon. They had moved there under protection, a new identity provided to them by a branch of the government that believed they had done the right thing. It wasn't the life they had planned, and it certainly wasn't the quiet retirement they had once dreamed of, but it was real. And more importantly, it was honest. Sarah reached over and took Derek's hand. He looked at the tattoo on her wrist, the one with his name incorporated into the insignia, and he knew with absolute certainty that no matter what happened next, whether they faced trials or persecution or complications he couldn't yet imagine, they had made the right choice. Sometimes, he understood, the path to redemption wasn't found in hiding or in compartmentalizing your past. Sometimes it was found in the simple act of telling the truth, no matter the cost. "Thank you," Sarah said, squeezing his hand, "for coming back, for being here." "I never left," Derek replied. "Not really. Even when we were apart, part of me was always with you. I think it always will be." They sat together as the sun set over Portland, 2 people who had been forged in darkness but had chosen to step into the light. And in that moment, Derek finally understood what it meant to be free. Not free from consequence or from responsibility, but free from the lies. Free from the compartmentalization. Free from the necessity of pretending to be something less than human. The promise of 30 years had been answered in 8, and Derek finally, after a lifetime of running and hiding, had come home.